Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to today's Cardiac College online session. Welcome to Heart Month 2021. And today we are delighted to be able to present one of our special topics. Often we are presenting on topics very close to the heart. Here today we want to have a session about a very relevant topic in society around COVID-19 vaccines. Of course, relevant to our health in general and certainly to our heart health. You'll see that we have a nice schedule of topics for the rest of the month. We'll return to these at the end of the session. The outline for today is that we'll talk about the approach to vaccines and why they're important. The foundational elements will be a discussion about pathogens, germs in our environment, and our body's responses using our own immune system. We'll talk about the phases that are involved in developing vaccines, and then the types of vaccines that are available currently for the prevention of COVID-19. Importantly, as always, we'll be very interested in seeing what questions you might have, and we'll encourage you to use the functions in this Zoom platform to enter your questions into the Q&A, and we'll endeavor to get to those by the end of this session. Of course, we'll also invite you to connect with your own healthcare provider if there are any very specific questions about your own situation. We want to call out one very specific resource that's also a very nice way of looking at vaccine development. And this video that's available at the Health Canada website, you'll see the address below at canada.ca. If you type into your search engine COVID-19, how vaccines are developed, there's a nice 4-minute video that will be a nice condensed version of the materials that I'm going to present today. But since we have time together, I thought I would take our own version of the story about immunity, pathogens, and vaccines for the next little while. And some of the materials that I'm drawing from are actually located at the World Health Organization website that you see there, who.int. And if you wanted information about all kinds of global health issues, and then a lot of information specifically about COVID-19, we would invite you to visit that website. And there is a section there about vaccines that is available. And over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll be showing you some of the details around the vaccine information from the WHO. So here we go. Some ground setting about this notion of pathogens. Pathogens, a Latin word, patho meaning disease, and gens, agents of disease. We've been living this for throughout our lives, but intensively over the last year or so. I think we're all aware that COVID-19 has crossed its kind of anniversary in North America, and we've seen the devastation arising from this virus. Pathogens or germs, to use a lay term, are all around us. They live in the environment, in the dirt, in the air, and also within our bodies, that we're at a balance point with all of these kinds of germs. When this becomes an issue, a person is susceptible, meets an organism that can be harmful, and this is what leads to disease. So when germs get into parts of our bodies where they don't belong, like in our lungs or in our gut or in our bloodstream, this is the setting to set up disease. There are different kinds of pathogens: bacteria, fungi, and viruses. And viruses, of course, is the family of germs to which COVID-19 belongs. The body has excellent defenses for the most part against pathogens. Our skin is one excellent example where it is a barrier against things coming to us. The mucus and cilia, the little hairs that line our nose or our respiratory tract or our lungs, these are physical barriers to prevent pathogens from getting into our body. But unfortunately, pathogens, if they are persistent enough and infectious enough, they can get into our body past our defenses and attacking us. If that happens, if a virus, for instance, gets into our bloodstream, then the next line of defense is triggering the immune system. A pathogen, as we've said, is a bacterium, a virus, a parasite, or fungus that can cause disease within the body. Each of these viruses or pathogens is made up of several subparts that's very unique to that pathogen. I'm sure everyone has seen this image of a mock-up of what a COVID-19 virus looks like. And you've seen that there are these kind of red triangular proteins on the surface of the COVID-19 virus. These things are called spike proteins because they stick out. And that's part of the name of the coronavirus. Corona is the halo or the crown or the spikes. And this spike is also important because we can denote this as the antigen. The subpart of the pathogen that causes formation of antibodies is called the antigen. So knowing that these dangerous kind of red spikes are there, we can also look at them in the context of our immunity and then further vaccine development. In a kind of happy defense state, when the body sees an antigen from the pathogen, the body will produce antibodies. Antibodies goes against the antigen. Antibodies are like soldiers in our body's defense system. Consider them as like the army that's waiting in response. Each antibody or soldier in our system is trained to recognize one specific antigen. So if we have had influenza of a certain type in the past, the flu virus, and we see the same virus again, well, we may have trained soldiers that are ready to come out and fight that off. We have thousands of different antibodies in our body, like thousands of different armies. Sometimes they may be very active, sometimes they are in reserves. And, again, we use the same kind of term for the soldiers that might be living in Canada, for instance. When the human body is exposed to an antigen for the very first time, it can take time for the immune system to develop a response and produce antibodies. The corollary is if we've never seen something before, we may have very little protection to that invading pathogen. But once the antigen-specific antibodies are produced, they will work with the rest of the immune system to destroy that pathogen and stop the disease. So we have other white blood cells, for instance, that can come and actually physically attack viruses and bacteria. We have certain organs in our body that can pull out those dangerous sorts of antigens and viruses from our body and process them and get rid of them. Unfortunately, antibodies to one pathogen generally don't protect against another one, except when two pathogens are very close to each other. So in our lifetime, we will have seen hundreds of different kinds of viruses. We will have experienced colds and flus over time, and we will have built up antibodies or soldiers against those kinds of things. But they may not offer us protection, unfortunately, for this thing called COVID because we've never seen it before. When our bodies produce antibodies in the first response to an antigen, not only will it produce some antibodies, but it will also produce some memory cells that remain alive even after the pathogen is defeated by those antibodies. So if that virus or pathogen comes around again, our antibody response will be much faster and more effective than the first time. So the immune system can learn and it can actually remember. And if we get exposed to the same dangerous pathogen in the future, the immune system will be able to respond immediately, protecting against disease. This kind of memory is the foundation behind vaccines, because we can try to create this setup in our bodies against the COVID-19 virus. So this cartoon tells us about some of the things that we may have seen in the past. So for instance, measles, and in this stylized cartoon, let's say that the antigen is this triangular spike on measles. Well, measles, whether we've actually had the infection or whether we've had the inoculation, the vaccine against it, induces antibodies to be formed. So if ever measles was to be introduced back to us again, we would have a good set of defenses. Similarly for chickenpox, and in this case, the stylized antigen is kind of this block-like three-pronged thing, and we've got different kind of antibody against that. We may have had certain strains of the flu in the past, and we may have antibodies against that. But the challenge, again, that we're setting up here is that if we have a new pathogen like the coronavirus, unfortunately, for many of us, we may not have antibodies to protect us against that new pathogen. And this is the problem with COVID-19. So this is where vaccines will enter into the story to try to help us out with our immune response. Vaccines are an external injection of an inactive part of the virus, or a component that can actually trigger an immune response within the body. The newest vaccines, like the ones that we are talking about, very much so regarding COVID-19, don't really contain the virus itself, but they contain a blueprint for producing antigens. And when we talk about this thing called messenger RNA, that's what we mean by blueprints that can produce things like the spike protein. Regardless of whether the vaccine is made up of the antigen or the blueprint, this weakened version that's contained within the vaccine is not going to cause disease. So a vaccine for COVID-19 will not cause COVID-19, but what it will do will prompt the immune system to start getting kicked up, to start producing antibodies or their soldiers, so that if we ever do see COVID-19 in the future, that we'll have a pathway to fight that off. So the vaccine may contain a fragment, like a spike protein of COVID-19, to induce the new antibody. And we might inject the antigen directly, or we might inject a blueprint that will lead to formation of these antigens inside of our body, and our bodies will respond by producing the antibodies. Some vaccines are going to require multiple doses, spaced apart by some weeks or by some months. And this is needed to allow the production of long-lived antibodies and development of memory cells, much like the design of a rocket. In order to get it into space or to the moon, while it itself might be effective with some of its own machinery and boost and it contains its own rockets, it may need these other booster rockets on the side to get it to the level where it needs to. We said with immunity that it can take some time for the body to figure out how to produce the antibodies and the soldiers that give us defense. And that's the idea of giving multiple doses over time. And many of the new COVID-19 vaccines require a first dose and then a second dose, and maybe in the future, further doses to really get the immune system to get primed up the way that it needs to give us the optimal amount of immunity with our antibodies and defenses. Another important concept around vaccination and health of our communities is this notion of herd immunity. thinking about herds of livestock, but also herds of people. When someone is vaccinated, an individual, they are likely to get protected against the targeted disease if they get their first vaccine and the second and the required boosters. But not everybody can be, or dare I say, wants to be vaccinated. Well, if we can have enough protection with enough people getting vaccinated, then folks who do not get vaccinated can still be protected if they live in amongst others who are vaccinated. And when we get to enough people in the community being vaccinated, the pathogen has a hard time circulating because most of the people that it will encounter are actually immune, that it can't skip from one person to the next. So the more people that are vaccinated, the less likely people are who are unable to be protected by vaccine, they will be at risk. This is called herd immunity. And in a cartoon style, if this individual is getting vaccinated and they get their series of vaccines, then they'll kind of develop a bubble around themselves, a vaccination protection around that one individual. So when we get a whole bunch of people vaccinated, then this is when we can work towards herd immunity. And this is important for people who can't be vaccinated, but who may be susceptible. So this notion, if this person in the middle and these people on the side can get vaccinated, but this young person or this person living with the condition, maybe they can't get vaccinated, but the idea is that the virus will have a hard time transmitting around this community because there are enough people who have protection that it just is going to be blocked from passing along. So this is the hope that we'll get to over the coming months as we roll out COVID-19 vaccines through the community. Okay, so we've talked about pathogens. We've talked about how our immune responses might get triggered and the importance of getting individuals vaccinated and hopefully the majority of individuals getting vaccinated. One other important concept around vaccines that's creating concerns and a need for understanding is that there are different components within any vaccine. And this is the stuff that might actually be important for the discussion around safety or allergy. So within any vaccine, there is that component of the antigen or the blueprints to develop an antigen. And that part, again, we've said is important for the immune response. We've said that this stuff does not cause disease like the infection. It is an inactivated component here. In order to deliver that antigen or the blueprint into the body, you can't just inject that directly, that needs to live in a solution or the vaccine components to help carry it along so they can actually get into the body. There may be components that are along for the ride to carry the antigen or the blueprint around. There may be preservatives or stabilizers so that the antigen can stay in the solution for some days or weeks or months. There may be components so that the entire solution is in a positive formulation so that it can be delivered into the body. The stuff may be dissolved in some sort of liquid so it can actually get into the body. And then there might be some other components as well. So let's explore these over the next couple of minutes so that we've got a good appreciation of what this vaccine might look like. So as we've said, the antigen or the fragments of the vaccine or the blueprints for making the tiny fragments are the antigenic component of that vaccine. There's other ingredients to keep the vaccine safe and effective, and they've been a component of billions of doses of vaccine over the many decades that we've been using vaccine. And the other components that we've alluded to are important in the manufacturing process. And we should be reassured that all of these ingredients have been tested for safety. The antigen, as we've said, is the active component that generates that immune response. The antigen in the vaccine, as we've described, is the stuff that triggers the immune response. It will not make you sick unto itself in terms of disease. But if our bodies get a very quick immune response to that antigen or the blueprint, that's the stuff that can trigger things like fever. It's a sign that our bodies are actually kicking up its immunity in response to the vaccine. Preservatives are an important component of the vaccine as well, and they are the components that prevent the vaccine from being contaminated once the vial is opened. So we've heard in the news just over this last weekend that when the company Pfizer-BioNTech ships a vial of vaccine, in that vial are sufficient doses for 5 or 6 different doses for individuals. So when you flip open the vial and draw out the first one, you want to make sure that what's ever left in that vial will still be safe and preserved to draw out the next 4 or 5 doses from that. And that's the role of the preservative. And some vaccines may not have a preservative because they only have a single dose, but in case the COVID-19 vaccine, many of them have multiple doses within that one single vial. And that's nice because then there's economies of scale and we don't have to have even more single components that are shipped and frozen and delivered and moved around. You'll see that there is this kind of chemical called 2-phenoxyethanol, a kind of alcohol that is used as the preservative so that there aren't any dangerous things that get into the vaccine for itself. Stabilizers prevent chemical reactions from occurring within the vaccine and keep the vaccine components from sticking to one another. And stabilizers may be like a sugar or an amino acid or a gelatin or something like albumin. So there's different components within the vaccine to keep the vaccine stable in its form if it sits there for days or weeks or months. Surfactants keep ingredients in the vaccine blended together so you don't get clumps. Surfactants are used in food products so that there's a nice smooth consistency to them. And then there are other parts in the vaccine that are called residuals, that they are not active ingredients in the vaccine itself, but they are important to just keep everything together. And they are present in very, very small quantities. A diluent is the liquid that is put into the vaccine to mix it up into liquid form. Most commonly, this might be water or a saltwater solution. And then there are adjuvants that may be important to keep the vaccine at the injection site for a little bit longer. So if you inject the vaccine, like the COVID vaccine, into the upper arm, you may want to keep it there for just a little while to start to trigger the immune response locally before it spreads out more widely. So each of these components has the potential for triggering some sort of allergic reaction, may trigger things like soreness in the arm at the injection site. These are very important to keep track of. They're important to be aware of, but they in themselves may not be particularly dangerous to an individual unless someone has had a severe allergic reaction to one of these components. And that's why there is lots of attention in the screening for COVID-19 vaccination, for instance, to people who might have had allergic reactions to these things. Okay. Pathogens, immunity, the role of vaccines to kick up immune responses. Vaccines in their different components of antigens, plus the chemical components to hold up those antigens so that they can get into our body. So nice kind of theoretical framework on why vaccines might be developed, and kind of a thoughtful process. So if you've developed one of these things, how do we know that they might be safe and effective for people? And how did we get to where we are within the course of a year? Well, here is a bit of an overview about how vaccines themselves might be developed. And then we're going to take this to the COVID-19 vaccines themselves. So as with every kind of medicine that is produced, every vaccine must go through very extensive and rigorous testing to ensure that it is safe. And each country will look at that vaccine in the context of its own regulatory or safety framework. There are certain steps and the medical terms for these that we hear about in the news, are these kinds of language being used. So every vaccine that is being developed first must go through some screening and evaluation. And the first step might be is if we deliver the vaccine into some sort of biologic system, do you actually get an immune response? Do you get the triggering of antibody formation, like that first defense or the first kinds of soldiers? The very first preclinical, before clinical phase is often done in a system other than humans. So there may be some kind of animal system, say with mice, where you might take your first kind of vaccine candidate, inject it into a mouse, and then measure if there are antibodies being formed. If that seems to be happening, then it goes then to the next phase of testing in human clinical trials. And these are often described in 3 different phases. And, understandably and logically, they're called phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, where we go from a small number of people to a medium number of people to a large number of people in broader use. And we'll describe these things in detail. Phase 1. In phase 1, the vaccine is given to a small number of volunteers to assess its safety and its ability to generate an immune response, and often to look at what the right dosage might be. Typically, this kind of phase 1 testing is done in young, healthy adult volunteers. So in the setting of COVID, these would be the lowest risk individuals, but they would be the ones who might be able to tell us, is this vaccine actually okay? Does it cause a lot of pain? Do I get a fever? Can I actually measure an antibody response? And if that seems to be happening and seems to be well tolerated, then the vaccine will move on to phase 2. In phase 2, the vaccine will be given to several hundred volunteers. Once again, we're looking for safety, we're looking for immune response, but then we're going to look at a broader population. So as we've all been hearing and experiencing, the people who might be at greatest risk from COVID-19 will be some younger people, but we're also interested in older individuals who might be even at greater risk for developing complications related to the COVID infection. So some of the older individuals, as well as some of the younger individuals, and some men and some women, and people with diverse ethnic backgrounds may be pulled into these phase 2 studies to see, again, are we getting the right kinds of immune responses? Is the vaccine tolerated okay? How much fever, how much pain at the injection site are we getting? And we might do this in a few different groups with a few different small-ish studies, and then we'll get the information, okay, this really seems to be working all right. Let's now scale up to see what's going to happen in a bigger study called phase 3. At this stage, the vaccine is now going to be given to thousands of volunteers. And the important part now is that we're going to take thousands of volunteers and divide them into half. Half will get the vaccine, half will not get the vaccine. They may get a injection that just contains sugar or salt and water, for instance. And the important part here now is we're going to assess whether the vaccine is effective against prevention of disease. So we go beyond measuring whether antibodies are formed in the body to the next stage of, does it actually prevent an infection? We're interested in safety in a much larger group of people. And typically these studies are going to be happening in multiple countries and in multiple different places, so that we'll get a much better sense of whether this vaccine is going to work in society. So the vaccines that have been proved to date have gone through these different phases of early preclinical studies, to the first ones given to healthy volunteers to study whether we get immune response, to the next ones of a few hundred people to see if we get immune response in a broader range of people, to the phase 3 studies of tens of thousands of people being exposed to virus and preventing infection. So that brings us to the next phases of research design, of very important in the research that we do blinding to know whether we've got a true signal here. So important, the gold standard in research studies is to shield the volunteers from knowing whether they actually received the vaccine or placebo, and also to shield researchers who are looking at the data from knowing who got vaccine versus who got the placebos, until we see all of the outcomes. And then everybody is going to know about this as well. So blinding is an important component of research. And then finally, when the phase 3 studies are done, they are submitted for regulatory reviews. And we see these stories in the news kind of on a daily basis. You know, the latest profile of the medications have been submitted to Health Canada in Canada, and in the Food and Drug Administration in the US, and the European Medicines Association in Europe. And each of the bodies will look at the efficacy, does it work, and safety, is it safe, before these vaccines are released for the population. Sometimes they get an emergency approval because of the extraordinary circumstances, but every vaccine is looked at in detail by a panel of very experienced experts in the area to look at the safety and efficacy. And then beyond the phases of 1, 2, 3 is a phase 4, where we are into this right now, that there is a system to monitor the safety and effectiveness of all vaccines. So when one goes for a COVID-19 shot, you will be also recruited to share your experiences about adverse events that happen, for instance. And we need this to figure out what's going on once this gets into the entire population. So this whole process, from looking at pathogens, to understanding what our immune responses might be, to designing different kinds of vaccines, understanding that this triggers our immune responses, to these phases of vaccine development, have led to the production of a number of different vaccines. And this is with tremendous excitement. And I think anyone who talks about this marvels that this has happened within the course of under a year, which has never been done before with other vaccines, but it's been building on this amazing science that has come together. So we have heard about different kinds of vaccines that are available in Canada and elsewhere in the world. The next part of this discussion will talk about a few of these vaccines that are available to us. I'm not trying to promote any kind of particular vaccine. I'm not saying one is better than another. I think we're happy when the population will be able to get any one of these things. I just want to give a little bit of description building on the details that we've talked about over the last few minutes. The first one of note are this category of mRNA vaccines. Messenger RNA, I think we've heard described as like the blueprint of the antigen. So we're not giving you virus per se or a protein of the virus. We're not injecting the spike protein. What we're injecting is a blueprint to tell our cells to make some spike protein, just the protein itself, so that's not infectious. And by producing some spike protein of the COVID-19 virus within our body, now it can trigger this immune response to make the antibodies. So very interesting, elegant kinds of research that have been brought to the forefront. The BioNTech Pfizer vaccine is one example of this, and the Moderna vaccine is an example of this messenger RNA viral kind of blueprint that's been introduced in that vaccine platform. There's another kind that's associated with the AstraZeneca Oxford University, as well as a new one from Johnson & Johnson that's coming out very soon. And this one, we'll talk about its attributes in a moment. And then there's another one from Novavax that's also been under review in the United States. So what's the characteristic of some of these vaccines with the data that we've been talking about? The Pfizer BioNTech vaccine is an mRNA. It's given as 2 injections. Its other interesting attribute, this is the one that you've heard about, needs this super cold condition of minus 70 degrees Celsius for storage, which limits its ability to be transported all the way around. We talked about the different phases of study, and the interesting parts, of course, the excitement was with the phase 3. So when this was studied in about 30,000 people, it was suggested that it was 95% effective against clinically evident COVID-19 infection, meaning that the half of the group that got placebo, when they were followed over the course of weeks and months, 170 people in the placebo group developed, 162 people developed an infection in the placebo group. In the vaccine group, this number was reduced markedly to only 8. So a big difference in the development of clinically evident COVID-19 infection, dramatically reduced by 95%. But I will point out that it was not universally protective. That is, that there is a still small risk of developing infection even after receiving vaccination, which makes it important that we do all of the public health measures even after we get vaccinated. But it is a marked improvement in the situation after vaccination. And this is consistent across different ages, across different sexes, races, and ethnicity. The things that we don't know about the virus is how it might prevent asymptomatic infection or carriage. That is, even if you got the vaccine, is it still possible that you might pick up the virus and carry it on and transmit it to somebody else? We don't know about that because this endpoint was about developing clinically evident COVID-19 infection. People who developed cough or shortness of breath or runny nose, those sorts of things. That's what clinically evident COVID-19 infection is, not people who seem to be well but still carrying virus around. So that's the Pfizer BioNTech one. The Moderna one is also an mRNA vaccine. Its advantage is that it doesn't have to be quite so cold. And after it gets thawed out, it can be just kept in a fridge for up to 30 days and injected. So that's why this one has been very attractive for use in long-term care facilities, for instance, because it can be transported in the super cold, but then be put into the fridge at the local facility for injection. This was approved in the US and Canada and had a very similar rate of protection against symptomatic infections for the populations that were studied. The AstraZeneca Oxford University one uses a different kind of technology where you actually put spike protein in the form of a virus vector. So you package it in a different kind of virus, inject that into the body. It doesn't cause infection. It doesn't cause COVID-19 infections, but it tells the body, I want you to make this stuff. I want you to make spike protein. And when that is used, it was shown to be up to 90% effective in preventing infections, in particular severe infections. And its interesting thing was that it had very kind of more liberal conditions for storage, and also made it attractive to send around to different environments. So through the UK, that it was kind of used in a community very, very widely because it was very favorable in terms of how it's stored. The newest one that's getting some attention is the Johnson & Johnson one, and it's exciting because it only needs a single injection to give pretty good protection, especially against moderate to severe COVID-19. And in the large study that was done, it seemed to provide complete protection against COVID-19. So given the challenges in vaccine rollouts, the need for people to come back for a second dose after the first one, with the first vaccines, the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna ones, this is being seen as a very positive advance in terms of a new kind of product that might be available. And then finally, this one from Novavax uses a completely different technology once again, been studied in many countries once again, showing good rates of efficacy, and it's being submitted for review. So having at least now these 5 that have been or are very close to being approved creates the opportunity for a broader array of vaccines in our environment, which is very important given the hiccups that we've seen in terms of delivery from any one particular company. Everybody wants this stuff. Everybody wants this stuff around the world. And we need to obviously scale up. We as society need to scale up to billions and billions of doses so everybody in the world can receive a vaccine in a reasonable time frame. Speaking of time frame, and this is maybe the question that everybody is asking, so when is it my turn to get vaccine? And this is such an important question. I wish I had a good answer for you, and I know at least one of you on the conference today is very interested in a specific answer, and I can't give you one, but here are some ideas at least. If you look at the COVID-19 vaccine or the COVID-19 website in Ontario, I think that's a good place for folks to go to for information about COVID, about infection rates, about vaccination as well. And this kind of guidance is being updated kind of regularly. There is a very smart expert panel in Ontario, as well as in Canada, that is advising about vaccine rollouts. The information is updated very regularly given the dynamic nature of vaccine development, approval, availability, distribution. The general phases that have been described for the for the environment have been for phase one. This is where we're at right now, that we're hearing about in the news all the time. Given that there is a limited supply of vaccine, even today, the priority has been given to long-term care homes, in retirement homes, and other congregate settings, and remote Indigenous communities, and some healthcare workers in hospitals. All the people who are seeing COVID at the front line right now, whether it's in the facility, whether there's transmission in the community, and especially if there's a high risk of bad things happening related to infection, those are the folks who are being prioritized for vaccine rollout. And that's where the vaccine injections are happening in the moment. In the next phase, where there is more vaccine that is available, and hopefully that's happening week by week, that this will become available to all healthcare workers, all persons in long-term care and retirement homes, and people who are being managed in a home care environment, persons living with chronic conditions, and additional Indigenous communities. So in the February-March timeframe, I think we're going to see all of this happening. And then there's a long gap between March and August where the description is vaccines available widely across Ontario. So, it's kind of good to know that sometime this year your turn will come up, but I recognize that you may want some more specific kind of guesstimates of when this might happen. And we keep hearing from our authorities that would say if we had unlimited supply of vaccine, we could get this done much, much more quickly. And that's what we're hoping for. And that's what the excitement is of with each successive vaccine that's being approved that is safe and effective, that will increase the availability of vaccines by millions of doses in Canada and will allow us to move ahead more quickly. I did hear about on the news, and I did look at this to say, well, if you wanted to look at something that might tell you when your turn might come up, there is this interesting thing. There's always an app for something, isn't there? And there is this app that's developed by a research group called the Omni Calculator. And the Omni Calculator group does predictions for all kinds of things that are health related. And they developed a vaccine Q predictor for the UK. And then a couple of members of the research group developed one for Canada as well. Considering the complex environment, they've tried to develop some idea of when an individual's time may come up, considering things like age, where do you work or live, are you pregnant, what kind of role do you have? In particular, are you a healthcare worker or are you an essential worker? Do you live in an Indigenous community or do you live and work in a group setting? And considering the environment of what's available in our communities and who in society might want a vaccine, if you enter in your data for all of this, it will give you a prediction of where you might be sitting in the lineup. So if I entered in my own data as a healthcare worker and my age, then this is what it told me. Based on my profile, I might be in stage 1 of the national guidelines for COVID-19 vaccine rollout. There are between 0 and 5 million people in the queue, similar to me. I might then be receiving a vaccine between February of 2021 and July of 2021. It's a broad range, but at least it gives me some idea of where I might be sitting. And I think that that's probably reasonable in terms of where I think I will be sitting. So, you might want to try out something like this as well to see, given all of these factors, how might your time kind of shake out in terms of a vaccine queue? And the researchers are trying to update this information all the time based upon the Canadian government plan. All right. I've talked a whole lot, and hopefully you've been with me and feeling like the information's been useful. The quick summary is that the pathogens that we are experiencing are indeed real threats. And of course, COVID-19 is the biggest immediate threat of all. Our bodies are wired to have very strong immune systems and brisk responses. And under good conditions, we can deal with most of the pathogenic threats that we see. But new pathogens like the novel coronavirus can wreak havoc on our bodies before we can respond very effectively. The vaccines that we will be hopefully all be able to access in a reasonable time will help us prepare to deal with these new pathogens like COVID-19. Okay, I'm finally going to stop talking. I'm sure you're wondering, was I ever going to stop? I wonder if there might be any questions that you might have. I've opened the Q&A box. I don't see anything that is there. If anybody can type a comment, that would be helpful, just to let me know that you are there. You can type in that was useful, that wasn't useful, or you have a question. I'll wait for just a few seconds. It's also possible you may be completely saturated with information and you may feel like this is enough and you need to get on with something. Okay, I'm not seeing anything there and I'm mindful of time. So let me just flip my slides back to this, which will take us to reminder about what else is going on. And a couple of comments, Q&As. Thanks to those who are chiming in that this was useful. Thanks. And do I have a recommendation on a specific type of vaccine, whether it's an mRNA or a viral vector or a nanotechnology particle thing? And I would say, I think that they are all very useful. I think that they are all similarly effective. So I would be very happy for all of you to receive whichever kind of vaccine will be available next up. So let's all look forward to that. Okay, well, thank you for your time. A reminder that next week at this time block, we'll be doing our session about taking your heart medicines. Some of you may have heard that one already. We'll invite others that did not attend to come on back for that. And all of you, if you'll be prepared with some questions to pose during that session, it's important that we address the things that are in your mind. So thank you very much for attending. Have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.